Welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me now in studio, as usual, the one and only Captain Ron. Why has Russia always been considered our enemy? Why are they so secret? Why are they called the Third Rome? The history of Russia is very fascinating, and we have a gentleman today that's going to answer many of these questions. We have author Richard B. Spence, who has been on various documentaries on the History Channel and is a consultant for Washington, D.C.'s International Spy Museum. We'll be touching on several of his books, but his latest book, coming out June 1st of this year, 2017, it's called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925. Should be very fascinating. So please welcome to Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth, author Richard B. Spence. I don't think Richard was expecting the applause. How you doing, Richard?
Well, how are you today?
We are great, and we are excited to have you here because what a topic today, talking about the secrets of Russia, because Russia has been in the headlines almost every day since I can remember, even from the day I was born. It seems like Russia is always on our mind. And I'm glad you're here because you're going to be able to answer some of the questions that maybe the history of Russia that led to where all these answers that we're seeking today.
Right.
So how did you get involved in even wanting to know the history of Russia?
Well, you're not the first person who's asked me that, and you would think I would have come up with a
better answer.
I think the thing that probably initially attracted it to me, as opposed to, American history or French or British history, was that it was different. And yet there were things that were familiar about it. So Russia it's one of those things that today people usually talk about Europe as distinct from Russia.
Right.
Even though you can argue geographical fine points that Russia is a geographical, or part of it is a geographical part of Europe. And yet still the European Union, Russia seem to be two separate entities. And that's one of the things we might get into, is that in Russian history, within the Russian national idea itself, is always been this lingering question of where exactly do we set in Europe? Are we culturally a part of Europe? Are we
right.
partly geographically there, or are we something else entirely? So what I saw in it were things that, for the most part, people that tended to look pretty much like me or like the people I was familiar with. And yet I remember one of the first things that sort of interested me about it, and this probably goes back to like junior high, which is a dangerous age, was simply the fact that Russian was written in a different alphabet, but as you and many of your listeners may know, and viewers, that may look slightly the same, but letters that appear, what is a P in our language is an R in Russian. And then you have that really fascinating thing that looks like a backward R that isn't an R at all. But that was the type of thing I was sort of interested in the culture, in the language. And then, I eventually just got drawn into the whole kit and caboodle.
Well, that's what I find fascinating, because when I first saw the Russian alphabet, I thought I had a stroke, because I was like, "What is this?" And I'm gonna see if I can show a little sample of for our viewing audience, and for the listeners, you're gonna have to go to our YouTube channel to see it. But can you explain a little bit about this, because who influenced the alphabet of Russia?
Well, if anybody out there was in a fraternity or a sorority,
that's what it looks like.
Yes, you might recognize some of these, because the Russian alphabet is derived from the Greek alphabet.
Right.
So, and fraternities and sororities take their letters from the Greek alphabet, and so there's that's what it was developed from back in the Middle Ages, but it has its peculiar characteristics as well. So it includes letters that, again, a P, what makes the sound P in the Latin alphabet, the same symbol is an R. That's why if one translated literally the sort of Russian character, if you look at the Russian acronym for USSR, it looked like CCCP, and that was simply the Russianized, the abbreviation of the Russian. And so the letters can be deceiving in that they appear to be something you're familiar with, and yet they actually mean something. And then yet A is A in both languages. B isn't. and there are sort of two Z's, etc. So that maybe is a little way to sort of segue into the idea of this distinction, and one that has been around for some time, between Russia and the so-called West. Again, things that are familiar, but which in actual application mean very different things. Yet, we said that the Russian alphabet is derived from the Greek, right?
Right.
Well, so therefore, one of the things that Russia shares with the West, including America, is a legacy back to classical Greek and Roman literature and culture and law. Those are things that are common in both places. The Russian Orthodox Christianity is distinct from Roman Catholicism,
right.
And yet they both derive from the same traditions.
Well, because Russia, I mean, I think it started around 862 AD. Is that right?
Ninth century. 862 is a good enough date. That's when you get this guy Rurik.
Right.
Who's sometimes been described as the guy who was the first ruler of Russia. He wasn't, because there wasn't any Russia at the time. But, here's one of those things that is very often the case, and some people find this very frustrating about history. I find it interesting, is that the further back you go and the closer you try to look at something, the less there is there really to see. So the whole origin of where the word Rus came from, in other words, the country with, today we have Russia.
Right.
It's been there for some centuries, but the actual origin of the name is still a matter of debate, which means no one is sure. There are arguments that it actually referred to an area in Sweden, since Rurik wasn't a native of the territory. He was a Viking.
Oh, really?
That's something else which often isn't appreciated, is that there's a Viking influence and a whole Viking age in Western Europe. Well, there's also a Viking age in Eastern Europe and Russia. In fact, the whole foundation, the man recognized today as the sort of founder of the original Russian state before either of those things really existed, was Rurik, and Rurik was a Viking from Sweden. Not much everybody agrees about.
Well, I'm looking at the different variations of Russia, and I'm curious in your study, because in my lifetime there's been changes from the communism to democracy, and I feel back to communism, but they seem to still have the same values even though they changed these democracies. So through history, what has been the reality of the history? Has it been fairly the same? Because they're very secretive. You don't really hear a lot about what goes on. Like in our government, you seem to always know about whatever's going on. Have they always been pretty aggressive, secretive, or what's your thought on that?
Well,
or do we paint it that way?
Do we paint it that way?
Well, from their standpoint, the aggression always comes from the other side.
Of course, right.
Which is pretty understandable. And one way you can think of it is that Russia is Europe in many. Remember, we've got a society here which is based upon in Christianity and the Greco-Roman classical period. Aristotle and Socrates are as referenced there as they would be elsewhere. But what you have was a Europe that didn't experience or experience different things than what we tend to think of Europe. And we think of Europe talking about England and France and Germany and Italy.
Right, right.
Pretty much. That's the Western European idea. Renaissance, Reformation. So one of the differences between Russia and the West is that if you look at those things that sort of made the West what it was, part of that had to do with a medieval legacy of the Roman Catholic Church. And then, of course, to a Reformation, a religious struggle against the Roman Catholic Church. but you're not going to have a religious revolt unless you have something to revolt against.
Right.
So the influence of the papacy, the struggle between kings and emperors and the powers of the Pope. See, in the West, the state and the church never really became one. They were always two separate things.
Oh, really?
In Russia, they're the same. Actually, the Russians get that again from another tradition, the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire tradition. Right. But in Russia, there is the idea that the state and the church are essentially one entity, that they are unified in the person of the emperor. Whereas in the West, the Pope was always someone who was a prince in his own right, distinct from kings and emperors, etc., and held himself to be superior to them. So you can think of it this way. Russia is Europe without a high Middle Ages in the Roman Catholic Church. It is a Europe without a Renaissance. It is a Europe without a Reformation. It is a Europe without an Enlightenment. And it is a Europe up until the late 19th century without an industrial revolution. So all of those steps that made the West what it was by the time we get to the 18th or certainly 19th and 20th centuries, Russia had experienced a different Europe. That's one of the ways I describe it to students. It's not a matter as to whether Russia is part of Europe or isn't part of Europe. It's a different Europe. It's a kind of alternative experience. And that led to, well, different experiences lead to different values. They lead to a different way of seeing the world. Russia's historical way of seeing the world is of constantly being beset by predatory outsiders.
Right.
Maybe the biggest example I could give you that is that a very important, something that doesn't really figure in Western history is a Mongol conquest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all the other things that happened, the Mongols sort of came up to the edge and then they went away. But France didn't spend, or England didn't spend, more than 2 centuries as a subjugated vassal state of an Asiatic empire. Russia did. And that had a very important influence on the whole sort of geopolitical outlook, what windows you're looking from. And it's in parts a completely different experience to it. The other thing that imparted arguably to the Russian historical view is that not only did all of these bad things happen to us, there was the Mongols, and then there was, the Swedes, and then there was Napoleon and, Hitler. And there are ways that, yes, we've overcome all of those things.
Well, I want to know why Russia sometimes is called the Third Rome. I find that
we
fascinating.
teased that at the beginning. Yeah. Why is that?
The Third Rome. Well, it's based in Russian religious belief. And the first Rome, is Rome in Italy.
Right.
And that's where the Bishop of Rome, who became the Pope, was centered. And that was the sort of first.
The first Rome was in fact Rome.
Was in fact Rome.
Okay.
Now, the tricky part, and the third Rome is Moscow. All right. So the question is, how do you go from Rome, Italy, to Moscow? Well, that's where the second Rome comes in. And the second Rome is Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. But here's another one of these things, I always have to go forward in history, is that everybody knows about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell, right? All at once.
Right.
Well, actually, only half of it fell back in the 4th and 5th century. And the eastern part of the empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, whose capital was at Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, lasted another 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire. And that's historically, that's called the Byzantine Empire. And that's where the Orthodox Christian Church developed separately from Roman Catholicism. And that's where there was always an emperor in charge. And because there was a line of emperors in the East, because the state never collapsed the way that it did in the West, you never had the creation, arguably, of an Eastern Pope. And therefore, the patriarch of the Eastern Church and the Eastern Church itself remained subservient to the state. It never gained independence from it. Now, where did Russia get its brand of Christianity from? From the Byzantine Empire. So when Christian missionaries came into Russia in the 9th and 10th centuries, and about around 960 or so, Russia becomes formally Christianized. It is Christianized according to the Eastern Constantinople-based Orthodox Church. And that, of course, is something else that from the beginning makes it different from the Roman Catholic, Rome-based church in the West. And what happened was that Constantinople, the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire, falls in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. That's how it becomes Istanbul. And that means that the capital, the sort of leadership of Orthodox Christianity, passed from Constantinople to the capital of its sort of greatest clone, which was Russia. And thus, back in the 15th century, after the fall of Constantinople, Russian theologians began to think about in terms of, well, what's our role in the world? What does this mean? Well, it means that we are now the third Rome, the real Rome. The first Rome sort of, went off the rail somewhere and fell under the control of the Pope that we don't recognize. And the second Rome has fallen to the infidels. And that means that the seat of the true Church of Christ on earth is now in Moscow. So what does that mean in practical terms? It means that the third Rome is the basis of what you could call the concept of Russian manifest destiny. So if you consider that your capital, that you are now the third Rome, that you are the spiritual seat of the one true faith on earth, that means that in your mind, you're an important place. And that the future of the world is going to be influenced by you. So it's one of those things that Russia, a much older country than America, and America do share, is this concept of a manifest destiny in which our nation is sort of divinely destined to be the dominant power on earth, or at least one of those dominant powers.
That's fascinating. Wow. Well, everybody knows if you're listening to to our later video or podcast, this is 2017, and 100 years ago, we had we didn't, but they did. They had the Russian Revolution, and I want to know what makes this so important, and how are we still living with the after effects? At least, if not us, them.
Well, start out with that. Going back to one of the questions you asked earlier, is why is Russia important? Right. Well, look at a globe or a map. One of the basic reasons, it's big.
Yeah. Right.
It's really big.
Huge, yes.
It's 1/6 of the world's land area. I mean, even after parts of the USSR, the old Russian Empire broke away, the Russian Federation is still big. It's barely smaller. Now, some of those parts were very important. So one of the things that happens in Russia, remember, if a change in regime, especially in what happened in 1917, a catastrophic change in regime, at least ideologically, is one of those things that, because that will impact 1/6 of the land area, and it will impact a state that borders China and Europe. Mm-hmm. That's one way of thinking of how big Russia is. It shares a very, very long, thousands of miles frontier with China, and yet it also borders Europe. It also borders the Middle East in the Caucasus, and it stretches all the way up to the Arctic. So political change is there. Catastrophic political changes are going to have repercussions. So that's one part. It's just a big place, and what happens there matters. The other thing, though, about the Russian Revolution, 100 years, which was a process, not a single event. So here's another one of these little details that often gets glossed over. In 1917, there were two, not one, but two revolutions. The first one we've just sort of celebrated the centenary of, and that's the so-called February or March Revolution. There's none of these little details. Russians at the time also used a different calendar, so if it happened here in March, it happened there in February, and I'm not going to attempt to explain that any further.
That's okay.
So they don't do that anymore. But the March Revolution is when the Tsar was overthrown. So I sometimes, I've gotten this. I've actually, threatened some of my students is that if you come out of my Russian history course and you still think the Bolsheviks overthrew Tsar Nicholas, I'm going to flunk you. So that's the one thing I've tried to get them to learn. So the Tsar wasn't overthrown by the Bolsheviks. In fact, the Bolsheviks aren't even a significant force in March 1917. There may be 10,000, maybe it tops 20,000 active members. The Bolsheviks aren't even really a party in early 1917. They're merely a minority faction of a party. They haven't yet really constituted themselves as a separate entity. So nobody would take them particularly seriously. So what happened in this first revolution is that the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, then headed by Tsar Nicholas II, was overthrown in what was effectively not a revolution, it was a coup. It was a fairly carefully orchestrated coup, not by revolutionaries in the communist sense, not by the Bolsheviks, or even necessarily by socialists, largely by what you would identify as Russian liberals. Democrats, they might be called. These were all mostly, was organized by men who were leaders of parties in the Russian parliament, which then and now is called the Duma. And the other thing going on about the revolution is that there's this whole thing called World War I going on in the background, which Russia is doing very poorly in. And so one of the big questions in Russia in 1917 was, does Russia stay in this losing, disastrous war, or do we find a way out of it? Now, what everyone had pretty much concluded, what the men who overthrew Tsar Nicholas concluded, is they didn't think that Tsar Nicholas had the gumption or guts to see the war through. And they were determined to do that. So they were determined to stay in the war and to align themselves more closely with the British and French, you know, for various economic and geographic advantages down the road. And this is partly why that first revolution was generally welcomed. Now, keep in mind, the United States was the first nation to recognize the new post-Tsarist regime. We beat everybody else to the punch. British and French were still trying to figure out exactly what this meant for them. Washington moved very quickly. And if you go back and look at the press of the time, the overthrow of the Tsar was almost universally greeted, particularly in the American press, as a good thing. In other words, it's this idea of the triumph of democracy. Okay? Right. We got rid of the awful old Tsar, and now Russia is under the leaders of the Duma, so it's going to become a democracy just like us. And it didn't. Not anything like it. And there were many people in America. One of them was a very influential industrialist by the name of Charles Crane. I have a lot to say about him in my book. But Charles Crane was a very, nothing too weird by today's standards. He was probably the equivalent of a billionaire, if you allow for inflation, and used his money to dabble in politics. That sounds kind of unusual. And to fund rebel and revolutionary groups and to make friends of potential leaders. And so Crane was one of those people, I think, that, once Tsarism was gone, Russia was just going to become like America. It was going to follow the same kind of political pattern. And that was, at best, a kind of naive belief. And it's one that defeats almost every attempt by one country to try to clone its political system elsewhere, is that the elsewhere isn't here. If you look at the American political system, the Luxembourgian political system, they're built upon all kinds of things that are unique to a particular place and culture. Americans do things just because we're Americans and just because that's all the way it's always been done.
Right.
How else do we explain the Electoral College, which everybody complains about and thinks ought to be abolished, but nobody ever actually tries to abolish. And it's just one of those little things that we do. And therefore, the idea that Russia was going to abandon all of its traditions and its 1,000-year history and become a new America wasn't likely to happen, and it didn't. So the question then became, well, why still didn't this supposedly democratic government that overthrew the Tsar survive? Well, the problem was it appeared to be democratic and it wasn't. Nobody elected it. But the people who ran it believed that they were now the masters of Russia's destiny. And they increasingly lost control of lost the difference between what they wanted, which was to aggrandize Russia further into their rule, and of course to pursue the war to victory. That wasn't what the population wanted. Right. The population was sick of the war. They were sick of anybody who wanted to talk about continuing it. And so when Lenin, leader of this far left faction, gets back to the country in April, just 100 years ago, 1917, he comes up with a very nifty little slogan: peace, land, and bread. And one of the reasons that it was a great slogan is that, like any good political slogan, it says a lot without actually pinning you down to anything. Peace, Well, everybody wants the war to end, but peace on what terms?
Right,
We're not going to discuss that. Land? Well, how much land, and who's exactly going to get it, and how's that going to be done? Well, we don't want to bother about that. And then bread. Everybody's going to eat, but how much bread, how often, what it's going to cost? Well, that's another question.
Right.
So, avoid the details. Simply put out the large picture, and that was, in the simplest form, was the beginning of Lenin's rise. He capitalized on popular discontent, and then he carried out. Then you come to the October Revolution, which is most people. That's when the Bolsheviks,
I thought you were going to say something
become
else.
the communists, take control. And that, again, is not some sort of popular revolution. It's a coup d'etat. So you see, really in 1917, Russia doesn't have two revolutions. It has two coups. Organized by active political groups in order to seize power. And so in the second one, the interim government between the Tsar and Lenin lasted about 8 months. And it failed. It became a failed state. And then you end up with Lenin, a revolutionary Marxian socialist in control of the largest country on earth.
Wow. So but Lenin actually made a coup. That's what you're saying.
No. And in fact, he doesn't make the coup. He's the one that wants it done. The guy that actually, go back to the little details. They always say history's in the details.
Right.
Lenin is not in what is today called St. Petersburg, which was then called Petrograd. Same city that was later renamed Leningrad. Okay, I know it's complicated. It's Petersburg, it's Petrograd, it's Leningrad. It's all the same place. But in what was called Petrograd at the time, Lenin isn't there when the revolution. He's not leading it. No, he's hiding in Finland in the woods because he's wanted for arrest in Russia. And what he's doing is hiding, dodging arrest, and he's sending messages to his followers in the capital, Petrograd, advising them, urging them to seize power. We've got the provisional government, which was this interim government, that this is collapsing. Now's the time. So do something. Just don't sit around, do something. Well, the guy who does something is Leon Trotsky. Ever heard of him?
I have not. Have you heard of him?
No, sir.
Okay. Leon Trotsky. Well, I guess if we'd all gone to a communist day school, we would know who Trotsky was. and if it was a American communist day school, he would be the ultimate villain. Because Trotsky was the guy who was really the guy, first of all, who carried out the October Revolution, not Lenin. He put Lenin's wish into action. And then he became, for some years after that, the head of the Red Army, the of Red Napoleon. And what everybody thought in the early 1920s, that this was the guy who was going to be Lenin's successor. But instead, of course, that turned out to be who? It turned out to be Joseph Stalin. Not somebody who in 1917 really played a very important role in anything. So if you go back to these big events, the seizure of power in October 1917, Stalin is, in a minor position at best. Trotsky's the architect of it. Lenin's the idea man who's waiting for and this is what happened. Trotsky organizes a coup that allows Lenin to come back and lead the government. So Trotsky, after the death of Lenin in 1924, is the guy that many people in and outside of the Communist Party around the world thought was going to take over, and he doesn't. This leads to a power struggle, very bitter, bloody power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky, which leads to Trotsky getting kicked out of the country in 1929, Stalin establishing his dictatorship, and you have some idea how that turned out. A lot of dead people.
Right.
But really one of the first cult of personality, absolute, if Russia didn't have an absolute monarchy under the Tsar, it got an absolute monarchy under Joseph Stalin.
Wow. I've learned so much already.
Absolutely.
This is great stuff. Well, one of the subjects I want to talk about, and it's one of my favorites, and I'm going to show this so people that are watching, is Freemasonry or Knights Templar. I want to know a little bit more about how Freemasonry and Russia, how did they combine? Because it was rampant.
That ties into the Truth Be Told world, right there.
Because we at Truth Be Told, we love the Freemasons. At least talking about it.
So you never think about it. You don't associate that with Russia.
Yeah,
ever.
you don't.
I would never associate that with Russia. That's a great You know?
Because you don't really hear a lot about it. You hear a lot about it in Europe, but not in Russia.
Oh yeah, people talk about the influence of, real or alleged influence of Freemasonry in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and it's there.
Right.
It's not a question as to whether it's there. The question is to how important is this? Is this, it's like the old question: you're talking about a symptom, or you're talking about the disease that causes the symptom.
Right.
So what's Freemasonry in that regard? But it's there, and the simplest thing to say about the Freemasons, they're everywhere. And they're in Russia as they would be in England or America or France or Germany. There aren't a lot of them, but it's there. But there's this distinction that has to be made between, and this is one of the things that I think leads to, and I have to add here, I'm not a Freemason. Okay, my grandfather was. My father might have been, but I'm not.
He's not.
If you were, would you tell us?
Maybe.
Oh, see. No, he just.
But no, I don't belong to any of these things, and people find that I'm just not a. See, I'm interested as to why people do join things, because I think it's kind of weird. Because you place yourself under somebody's authority. So I'm kind of interested as to why people join this or cults or whatever, but I have no interest in doing it myself. But Freemasonry was a whole sort of phenomenon in Europe beginning in the 18th century. It goes back further than that. Nobody knows from where, but by the 18th century, it becomes a kind of big deal when it begins to recruit people with money and then people in politics and the arts. And so, but there's this distinction to be made historically between British Freemasonry, the Freemasonry that came out of the Grand Lodge in London, and continental Freemasonry, or what's sometimes called Grand Orient Freemasonry, which comes out of basically France and the Revolution and is the main kind of Freemasonry on the continent and therefore in Russia. And I think the fundamental misconception is that people think of Freemasons as being a single organization in which everybody is controlled by some sort of central leadership. It's never been that case. You have different grand lodges that have different lodges that they sanction or recognize them, and you have lodges that operate outside of that. And I mean, here would be a case, if you look at the American Revolution, you can find all kinds of Freemasons on the revolutionary side. George Washington, there you go.
Right.
Shake a stick and you're going to hit one. But what often is forgotten is that you also have Freemasons on the other side in the revolution. So there were Masonic lodges that were loyal to the king. Every British regiment fighting in America against the rebels had its own lodge. And Benedict Arnold, arch traitor of the revolution, is a Freemason as well. So the same thing sort of applies in Russia's case, is that when you begin to look around, I mean, the argument is, and I've seen it mentioned, is that, well, all the Bolshevik leadership, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and others we were mentioning, they were all Bolsheviks. They weren't. Some of them were. Or that everyone around the Tsar was opposed to the Masons, or as if the Russian Masons were, again, a single group that had a single goal, which they don't. They're divided into groups that work against each other.
We don't think of it that way at all. I would absolutely think that all the Freemasons in the world are together under one.
Yeah, me too. You would think. But
the difference between, give you this difference between what we'll call English Freemasonry and French or Grand Orient Freemasonry is essentially this. In England and in the British Empire, Freemasonry became the kind of chief fraternal organization and secret society of the empire, of the British establishment. English Freemasonry was overall loyal to the monarchy, and it served the empire. I mean, that's why if you look at Rudyard Kipling, who was a Freemason and, the sort of poet laureate of British imperialism, that's why all his stories are larded with Masonic symbolism, and his heroes are Masons.
Right.
Because he saw this was, British Freemasonry is the secret society or the fraternal order of the British establishment. On the other hand, on the continent, Freemasonry became connected with revolution and anti-clericalism, which means their opposition to the Catholic Church.
This way they could win no matter what. They'd have somebody in there, right? It feels.
Well, it's, you think of it in the British case, and the British lodges never had any particular connection with the lodges on the continent. In the British case, Freemasonry prospered because it became the fraternal order of the empire, and therefore it had prime ministers, and it had people in the royal family, and it had people in parliament and in the foreign office who were members of it, and their membership in this provided a kind of invisible links between them. It's a way in which people could cooperate with each other across the aisle. You might have people who are representatives of different political parties, but the one thing that they do have in common is that they belong to the same sort of lodges. The lodges on the continent, not all of them, but many of them became lodges that were anti-status quo, that sought to overthrow existing governments. So instead of becoming a fraternal order that was associated with the political establishment, you became one associated with the groups that are trying to topple the establishment. So we come back to Russia. What's the influence here? There weren't a lot of, in the early 20th century, Russia had about 180 million people. And out of that 180 million people by 1917, there might have been at most a few thousand members of Masonic lodges.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not very many.
Not very many, but whenever, this is one of the thing about numbers, not very many, but who are those people?
Right.
Who are the few? Well, this is where you find that even though Freemasons are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of adult males in Russia, they are the people who are the captains of industry, the leaders of political parties. And for instance, remember I mentioned that there was that government that came between the Tsar and the Bolsheviks, the so-called provisional government. Almost every single person that served in that government was a Freemason. Again, that doesn't mean that they all agreed with each other and they didn't plot against each other. In fact, they had a grand old time betraying each other right and left. So it's not as if they're all cooperating,
right.
but it's one of the things that sort of drew them together in the first place. And it's one of those things that, to me, is historically significant about Freemasonry. And that has, and this is just my view, it has nothing to do with Masonic rituals or beliefs. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do instead that what a lodge creates, and remember the lodge isn't the place, it's the people within it. The lodge is the group of men who compose that group, as opposed to the building that they're in. But what the lodge creates, through its selective recruitment and through initiations and through oaths of loyalty, however serious you may want to take them, they're there. One of the things that does is it creates this kind of alternative family. It creates this group that binds people together in confidence. All right. So remember the whole idea is you don't talk about what goes on in the lodge.
Right.
Okay. That is something that what takes place here is separate. Well, if you leave aside all of the, forgive me, Masonic mumbo jumbo, okay, all of the aprons and all of the rituals and all the skeletons and closets and all the Hiram Abiffs you want to bring out, okay, if you put all of that aside and you just want to assume that the rituals they carry out, what you still create here is a community of interest. I mean, the reason why a particular group of men formed a lodge is because, well, they share ideas in common. And those ideas can be their commitment to Freemasonry, but they can also be their political ideas. So here's the significance to me. What lodges created, whether they intended to or not, okay, what they created was the perfect petri dish for political conspiracy and revolution. Because you had brought together in secrecy and confidence, a group of like-minded men of influence.
Right,
and imagine what happens when you do that.
Right. Yeah, and see, he because what happens in the club stays in the club is why he won't tell us that he's a Freemason.
Right.
So
right. He's not. He's not.
Absolutely not.
Well, listen, let's take that a step deeper because obviously we like the Freemasons talk here. What about, is there a role that the occultism played in Russia at this time?
Well, that's one of the things that's come up. It's another. I mean, you can even see that in films, like, animated children's films,
Right.
like Anastasia, which repeats all kinds of things that aren't true, but merely make a good story, which is, pretty much what history consists of. Things that really weren't true or didn't happen, but make a good story with a few other things added in. One example of that is probably a fellow that you may have heard of, and others, Rasputin. Right?
Yes.
Rasputin, the mad monk of Russia, the kind of, maybe Luciferian Svengali who took over the minds of the Russian empress, or in some way did some kind of bad stuff that caused, this is often seen, that Rasputin was one of the symptoms of the disease infecting the imperial regime, and that in some way he was responsible for the fall of the monarchy. And that's he makes a pretty good, spooky looking guy in this case. But Rasputin again was, what he fundamentally was a con man. Okay, it's nothing I don't think there's anything terribly, really that spooky about him. He was a resourceful, intelligent, and unscrupulous con man under cover of religion. Does that sound too unusual?
I was going to say it sounds very familiar.
And and he combined a certain amount of sexual mobo jobo with that, and that really got things going, and created this whole kind of mythology that surrounds it. But that's largely what he did. He sort of wormed his way into the confidence of the Empress Alexandra, and in terms of, if there was someone in the Russian establishment who was susceptible to occult influences or just anything with the occult, it was Alexandra, not Nicholas. Nicholas was interested in photography, not in anything else. But his wife was, for a variety of reasons, was drawn to what we might call, some people call religious extremism or religious mysticism. But, there's this very thin little line between religious mysticism and occultism. They're just the same thing under slightly different names.
It's the same time period of like the Aleister Crowley stuff, right? Isn't that?
Oh yeah, this is when he's sort of coming up as well. The 20th century, well, every century is full of them, but yes, they're there. So, but Rasputin, I think, gets more of this sort of undeserved credit for being an occult figure when he's essentially a kind of social phenomenon and kind of semi-criminal figure.
He does look like it too. If you're,
he certainly fits that part. I'll tell you. My God,
there's a little bit of Manson mixed in there somewhere.
He has those eyes.
But basically, he knew. He took advantage. He was a fellow who claimed to have spiritual, religious powers, and particularly applied those upon, one might argue, gullible women who had money, and that's where the empress kind of fit in. And then people could believe, one of the things that enemies of the regime put out, and used it in somewhat effective propaganda, was accusing the empress of being sexually involved with Rasputin. And there's really nothing, again, it makes a good story, but there doesn't.
But this is history repeating itself. This goes on throughout time. We talk about this in Egypt. We talk about it today.
Yep. No, I mean, it's the biggest, it's one of the most long-lasting cons you can come up with.
Right.
And, you've already got it half won. So Rasputin, the interesting thing about him isn't so much his occult influence, but the whole eye about his death. All right, so here's one of those things that you and the audience may have heard, is that when Rasputin was killed, he was, lured to a dinner party by his killers, and they poisoned him, and they shot him, and they bludgeoned him, and somehow they just couldn't kill him because clearly this was a manifestation of his great occult or spiritual powers, and he was thrown into the river still alive. Turns out, again, it's a good story, but it's not true. But the actual story is better. And the actual story is that, yes, there were a group of people who very much wanted to get rid of him because they thought that he was a moral degenerate whose connection to the imperial family was bringing disrepute on the monarchy. So here's a little interesting detail. The people who killed Rasputin weren't revolutionaries, had nothing to do with the Bolsheviks. They weren't Russian liberals. They were Russian conservative monarchists. There were people who wanted to preserve the monarchy, and they felt that Rasputin was helping give the monarchy a kind of bad name. Now, so he was lured to a house, basically on the promise that a certain woman was going to be there. the wife of the proprietor, and the proprietor knew that, and he was plied with poison. It appears that the poison was a little dated. It's kind of past its shelf life, so that might have had something to do with it. But the other thing is that he eventually was killed, and in this bungled attempt to kill him, first with poison, and then by physically attacking him. I think he was beaten and stabbed, but the people who were trying to kill him were Russian noblemen, and they're complete amateurs with these things. They really had no idea how to kill this guy. And so they try shooting him, and, that's not as easy as it sounds either. He's moving around, okay, and they've never actually shot anyone before.
That's 100 years ago. It's not.
And then and he escapes, and he gets outside, and it's the middle of the night, and they don't know what to do. So one guy who's there, the one guy that's never really talked about, but was there on that evening, was not a Russian, but a British intelligence officer by the name of Oswald Rayner. And what he basically did when his compatriots had failed to kill Rasputin was to pull out his service revolver and put a bullet through his head. He finished the job. Now, the question is, why was he there that evening? Yeah. And why was this a job that he needed to supervise, which then raises the question as to where the actual order for Rasputin's hit came from. Did it originate in Russia, or did it originate in London? And it's kind of both.
Wow. This is people even in the chat room are saying how fascinating this topic is today. We're almost out of time, but I want to know this last question. Because a recent poll in Russia showed that more than half of Russians want to see Lenin's body buried. So why hasn't it been done up to now? And is there any significance to the pyramidal shape of his tomb? Is it? I mean, how is it related to? Is it Masonry? Is it Egyptian, or what? What's your thought?
Well, Lenin, I think I mentioned earlier, dies in 1924.
Right.
Dies a relatively young man. Dies in his 50s. And there are various ideas of what he died from: arteriosclerosis, syphilis. There are different theories, probably some sort of natural causes.
Right.
And what then happened was that Lenin was the great spiritual leader in this. I mean, in an atheistic revolutionary republic, in fact, he had become the living God. And now God had died. So there was an idea that Comrade Lenin had to be honored in some way. And, and it wasn't just going to be enough to, dig a hole in the ground and put him in it and put up a marker. So instead, there was a discussion about the construction of a tomb. And it went through a number of different forms, but it eventually ends up, if you look at it today, as a kind of stepped pyramid. Now, that's architecturally interesting. It doesn't fit in with the rest of Red Square. And there is a kind of, occult significance to it, and even the preservation of the body. The guy, one of the head Bolsheviks who was really sort of organized much of this, was a guy named Leonid Krasin. And his name doesn't come up too much. But Krasin was very interested in what could be called esoteric or even occult ideas. And there was this whole concept that, one of the things that socialism, that communism can eventually do is to overcome death itself. Because remember, this is a new ideology which is going to create an earthly paradise. It is really, even though it opposed all religions, it has become a kind of faith in and of itself. So the concept that Lenin's body should be preserved, with a little sort of nod to the pharaohs and to saints whose bodies don't. See, that's one of the things. In the Russian Orthodox popular religion, there was a long-held belief that the bodies of the truly pure and holy, the body of a saint, would not decay. So they're actually sort of working Orthodox mysticism into this idea. But there is even, beyond that, an idea that Krasin and others considered as to whether or not by preserving his remains, we might be able to, get ready for it, reanimate him. Okay. And so this could either mean the actual reanimation of his physical being, or the preservation of tissues that could be used, I guess, in a modern sense, to clone him in some way. And these were, and there was a certain segment, there's a certain core within the Bolshevik leadership who really felt that was a possibility, or was an idea that should be preserved. But what you've got here is this whole concept to create the idea of a deathless leader. a leader whose body never decays, a leader who, it would appear, could just sort of rise up out of his tomb and resume control of the country. So it was sort of modern political propaganda by a communist state, but it also was connected to religious mysticism and even occultism and even to sort of sci-fi ideas of the reanimation of dead tissue. So that ties things together pretty well, I guess.
Well, if you clone, that's the problem. Is if you clone somebody, it's not going to be their same personality. I mean, he may be wearing high heels on the weekend, for all we know.
Yeah. But of course, they weren't thinking. They don't think about it. Right. This is another one of the things that runs through Russian history and everything else. I have to throw this in. What really makes history tick and what makes it interesting to study? The law of unintended consequences.
Right. Right.
See, human beings always come up with these grand plans about things, and our plans either don't work, or they end up having side effects that you didn't expect. So the idea is that everybody who hatches a plan, everybody who does something historically significant, like overthrow the, let's overthrow the Tsar and create a Russian democracy.
Right.
Did that work out? No, because of the law of unintended consequences.
Right.
And did that whole communism thing work out quite the way it was supposed to? No, law of unintended consequences. And I guess another way to think of it is that history has side effects. It's made by it's like the drugs you see advertised on TV. And at first it sounds okay. And then after the list of side effects, generally you'd be better off with whatever disease it was. One of the causes, which usually isn't death, which it often is otherwise. But that's what you get. We mess with one variable. You like to think of it that way. When you change one variable, you just changed 20 other ones that you don't even know about. And then you never get the result that you expect. And we poor old humans, we just keep plugging along, doing things.
Good lessons.
And never quite getting the result that we wanted.
Well, Richard, we so appreciate you on the show. The book comes out June this year, called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925. And do you have a website people can go to, or?
Well, the only way to go, if they go to the University of Idaho in the Department of History, you can find my website there, such as it is. So,
and guess where he lives? He lives in Moscow.
I live in Moscow, Idaho.
Oh, how funny! That's awesome.
And why is there a town in Moscow named Idaho? Again, you get good stories. You don't really get an answer.
Right.
That's awesome.
Well, we appreciate you, and you're going to have to come back because there's so much more we can ask you, and we hope that everybody out there picks up the book. There's other books that Richard has written. I think you're going to enjoy because we need to talk more about being part of the Spy Museum. So that's another one you have to come back for. So, but thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next time on Truth Be Told.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're going to take a break, and no, we're actually going to take a break because we're going to get out of here.
We're going to take a week break.
A week break.
And we'll see you next Friday at 4 o'clock.
Right here on Truth Be Told. Go to truthbetoldwebtv.com. Check out all of our upcoming guests. We have some great guests coming up. We're going to be at the Contact in the Desert for you UFO folks. And you can check us out on iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, and pretty much anywhere you can think of. So until next time, we'll see you right here on UBN Radio.